And today we have Nick Bonakowski, head of agent partnerships at Opendoor, here to sit down and talk about some of the research that they found in terms of a mismatched market, perceptions versus reality, some really great insights and takeaways. And Nick, thanks for joining the program.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks for having me.
Now, your title, head of agent partnerships at Opendoor, give us a quick background of what it is that you do at Opendoor, how you found yourself there, and kind of the background that makes you the right person to be talking to today.
Sure, I'd love to. So I'm coming up on about, well, almost 2 years at Opendoor now. But I've been in real estate, in and around real estate for most of my professional career, which sadly, not to date myself, goes back coming up on 2 decades. I've had about 15, 16 years in the real estate industry, starting.
How do you still have so much hair if you've been around in real estate that long?
You can't see the back of my head. I'll just say that. Gonna look forward on this camera for the rest of the time. But no, it's I can say that I've seen a few cycles now, and I'm sure we'll talk about later in this conversation kind of how this one is unprecedented. But I did grow up in a third generation real estate office started by my grandparents. First job was organizing the filing cabinets that our deal folders went into. And I remember in that job when I was 14 or 15, moving these folders up to the attic because it was a New Jersey law where I'm from. You had to maintain these files for 7 years. I remember in those early days thinking, man, I'm using my computer for everything. When is this part going to change? When's that going to change? So I've been fascinated with the industry and that intersection with technology, which has led me down a series of different jobs in the industry. Some years at some other big real estate companies, including Redfin. I actually worked at Realogy, now Anywhere Brands for a little bit, but always kind of at that forefront, that intersection of marrying the old with the new. The brilliance of all the new technology in the world alongside the local expertise that an agent can bring. So talking about how I'm in this, where I am at this role now as head of agent partnerships, it's really about meeting the consumer where they are. And that's generally the theme of our whole partnerships team at Opendoor, where we're trying to do a lot of interesting things to digitize the home buying and home selling process, working with consumers, giving them other options to move with the click of a button. On the partnership side, we also recognize that in 2023, while technology continues to improve the process, customers are comfortable working in different ways. And on agent partnerships, it's our recognition that many consumers have that trusted advisor in their local network. They want to work with that person. So my job is to basically reach out to the agent community, help agents and brokerages understand ways that they can partner with Opendoor to make Opendoor a solution for their customers that want the best of both worlds. The guidance from their trusted advisor and access to Opendoor's digital home selling or buying solution. So
I think that's awesome. One, it's great to see, always see people who have kind of that frontline experience. And so that background in the agent world of seeing transactions and being involved in transactions. Definitely that's always one of the missing pieces when we start abstracting to other layers of technology and finance and operations. And it's like, have you done this? You kind of, if you sit in enough brainstorming sessions with people who haven't been involved to that degree in the real estate world, it's just really hard to come out with what the consumer really does want. I think that's interesting. And then second, I think it's really interesting that part of the approach it appears at Opendoor is, hey, we need to have great data and great insights to share with agents as well as consumers as well as builders. And that's, again, kind of brings us back to this article of anything that can be used to inform, better inform kind of all of our mutual customers. It's good for everybody.
Yeah, totally agree. I mean, and that's one of the enjoyable and exciting parts of my role, actually. In addition to data, we have access to hundreds of thousands of consumers. So with that access, I agree with you, and there's a sense of responsibility around, well, how can we pull conclusions, not just keep them from ourselves, but really inform the broader population of vendors, partners, and the various folks that are going to be interacting with customers. And that's truly been like one of my favorite parts about working in the real estate industry, in that like at its heart, it's very collaborative. You know, the nature of buyers and sellers and representation on all sides, and that people are generally trying to work together. And that's what we're doing with a lot of these surveys that we publish, you know, with that access to consumers. You know, we can collect some insights and hopefully share them with the industry so, you know, they can better position their products, or for our agents, they can look to Opendoor and realize that, you know, we're here to, you know, inform and educate and make the process better for everyone out there. And along those lines, in addition to the data, which, you know, we'll walk through today, I have the privilege of talking to agents across the country, in my role, whether they're partners or just new agents that are interested in hearing about us, and that may be at conferences or individual office visits. But we have a team at Opendoor. Literally in the past 24 hours, you know, I've talked to an independent broker in Charlotte, in North Carolina, and I had a meeting with you know, one of the larger teams in the Houston market of Texas. So we get an interesting perspective, which is a theme we'll talk about a bit today, I think, in what's going on with mismatched buyer and seller expectations. But just this idea that, you know, real estate, we all know it's hyper local, but that's also true in what the data shows us, that it can feel like a hot market in one area, and it can feel extremely cold in another. So.
Yeah, and we'll have a link to the article in the show notes, and I'll show it here for those of you watching on video right now as well. But I mean, mismatched market, I love how it opens of, you know, everyone wants to try to summarize it down to a point of, is it a buyer's market or a seller's market? And I think the first thing of that the article really points out is that buyers and sellers are both in agreement that it's a tough market, but maybe for different reasons, depending on the side of it you're on. But no one thinks that the current market is a panacea for either side. Is that a fair way to say it?
I think so. I mean, I think when you pay attention to headlines, people have realized that it's been what I would call a seller's market for quite a few years, although that's shifted mostly because of the volatility. And I think, whereas if you had to get someone to choose buyer or sellers, you're going to have more folks that are going to say, well, it's likely easier to be a seller, just given the fact that inventory is extremely low and interest rates are triple what they were a year ago. That said, it is clearly a different seller's market, or less so than it has been in some of these crazy years of the last few. So yeah, you're generally just getting a lot of confusion, where I think people hesitate to answer that question as specifically. And that's part of the reason why we went into this research, just to kind of to settle this. And I think, as we see in the data, and you'll read in this report, it still is a little bit inconclusive, although there is some alignment on buyers and sellers. And I think the reality is that however people feel about how easy it might be to sell your home right now, there's just general agreement that it's tough. I mean, it is a tough place to be transacting. And most of the people that we're seeing moving are doing so because of, you know, life events, reasons that they have to move. Yeah. You know, you're dealing with a lot of speculative buyers right now who are looking to take advantage of some opportunity in the market. So,
yeah, and typically when you hear the terms buyer's market or seller's market, it's like everything on either side of the ledger is in favor of that audience, and that's what we're saying here, is that yes, it's still more a seller's market than not, but it's not. In past sellers markets, it's been like the seller can just state their terms and get what they want. There are going to need to be concessions, which we're going to talk a little bit more about at the end, or expected concessions on either side, and that's a little bit more nuanced. And of course, it all depends on the specific markets. But next in the article that I thought was really interesting, it says the top 5 housing market concerns all generations actually can agree on, and the top 3. So the question was, you know, what are the things about the housing market that's concerning to you? 77% said interest rates. 72% said home affordability, which I think is interesting. And a weak economy was 60%. The next two were not over 50%, but still a good portion. Lack of homes for sale, 34%, and high unemployment at 20%. Interest rates are an unavoidable reality. So that one we could talk more about that, Nick, but I want to maybe just have a little more conversation on your perspective of the next two, which is affordability doesn't really seem to be slowing people down. In the article, it talks about the fact that kind of the velocity of sales as a percentage of what's available, 3%, I think is a week roughly, is higher than it was in 2019. So even though it's a concern, it doesn't seem to be something that's actually causing transactions to pause. Where I think, again, in other markets, kind of like that would be something that would be reducing that speed of transaction.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a great call out, and I think it's exactly one of the points here that illustrates the title of this whole survey, kind of this mismatched expectations, mismatched market, where it's not really just mismatched expectations between buyers and sellers. It's mismatched kind of fact, or what consumers are telling us and then what they're actually doing. So people are reporting they have concerns about affordability, obviously interest rates, yet they're still transacting. And I think more than anything, that speaks to really one thing, and it's inventory. The fact that we're dealing with inventory levels from not seen since 2004, I think is the year we mentioned here. Just that in most markets, you're dealing with lower demand. You certainly have decreased buyer demand just because of interest rates. Some folks have simply been priced out of the market. Yet the only thing beating that decrease in demand is the decrease in inventory. So no matter how few buyers you have, they're still chasing fewer and fewer homes. So that unfortunately, it creates a world where home affordability can be a concern, but it doesn't change reality if there's still two buyers chasing one seller. I loved when you opened, you talked about what a true seller's market looked like, where there was this idea where you could put your home on the market and just say everything you wanted. I actually used a similar phrase in a conversation last week, where it was almost like a demand letter. You would go to the market and you'd publish your demand letter during your highest and best, and you'd say, these are the things I want. This is the closing date. This is the money down. This is the lender I want you to use. And this is exactly how you're going to close and what you're going to ask for in your inspections. I've definitely seen a step back from that type. So I think we're kind of in this transition period where the sellers who used to be able to do that, or the agents who used to be able to guide their customers to say, publish your demand letter when we do your highest and best, they're not encouraging that kind of activity anymore. Yet they are still going to market in most cases if they have, well-priced home in relatively good condition. They still are expecting multiple bids. They're just aware that it's not going to be quite what it was. So we're still in this mode where people are expecting, because there are so few of their neighbors on the market, that these buyers are going to have to overlook the concerns about the home affordability and the interest rates. The last thing I'll add there is that. Go ahead.
I think what's interesting is it's like this captured thing, because people who are choosing to transact now on either side, buyer or seller, are probably doing it because there is a innate need or prompting of circumstance that I was just reading another article today about the fact that home builders in my world, their concession amounts have been higher. Someone just recently, one of the public builders just announced that like 9%. On average, they're giving away 9% of their prices on incentives. Well, if someone is choosing to sell their existing used home in this market, they're probably doing so because there is a reason. So like the argument has been made that builders find the market faster because they have to sell all the time no matter what. And the used market doesn't have to. But the sellers in today's market are probably selling because there is something that makes it a have to situation. It's not going to be all the time, but it's more. So to me, the analogy is, I love analogies, Nick, is if I invited my wife to go out for a steak dinner, knowing that she likes steak, and I say the words, we are going to go get a nice steak dinner at a nice restaurant. And then we show up at the restaurant, the date has been made, we're there. And I look at the menu and I'm like, oh, dang, steak is twice what it used to be. At that point, I can be frustrated and I can express concern about the affordability of steak. But like, we're getting steak. It's not like we're going to say, hey, let's let's just leave the restaurant and go get Italian. Like, let's go head to Olive Garden. So I just think that that whole, and it's important for our audience as builders and developers to understand that you are going to get questions and objections and concerns around affordability. And you do need to be ready to speak to those, but also you don't have to have kind of an initial response of, oh my gosh, I must be overpriced or overcharging. Because again, kind of what you spoke to in nuance there was demand might be low, but supply is still lower in most cases. All right, moving on to weak economy. As 60% of people worried about the weak economy, is it weak? Is this is future projection, obviously, of the fact that it feels like things must get worse, but everyone's been talking about this as, the recession that has been the most anticipated recession of all time that still hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, I myself am confused. I don't know if the recession is happening today or is happening tomorrow. All I know is that it's in every headline that I read, and I think that is basically what most Americans experience as well. Jay Powell a few weeks ago talking about bypassing a recession. We have a bunch of different data points that would indicate it is a healthy economy. Obviously, we see unemployment towards the bottom of this list. I don't think that's a coincidence given how relatively strong employment numbers have been. Now, I will say that in this subject in general, I always guide and counsel any real estate professionals or people in and around the industry that if you want to be successful in real estate, don't ever talk about politics. Just a good approach on the sales side. And I think that as you get into the economy, these things become a bit political in that someone's always to blame for whatever the current economy is. So I think the reality is that we're in a media cycle where we're always going to be talking about the economy, how it could be better. What are the warning signs? Those kind of headlines get
I think the benefit is that generally people can be concerned. I think both home affordability and weak economy fall into the same place of, I'm really worried about it, in air quotes, but not in my own personal situation. Like, I feel like the economy must be getting worse or headed in that direction, but I just got a raise. I just got approved to work from home. It's like, but it's for everyone else to worry about. And at the end of the day, the people who are choosing to transact in this market, they have concerns about those things, but they also either feel like they may not apply. Anyway, that's like human nature.
Yeah, I think that is right on. And I think the reality is that for people that have been looking for homes, given how difficult it's been to find the home over the last few years with inventory, you have a lot of buyers that have been at the search for quite a while. So they're prepared. They have gone through the process you have to go through with a lender. Obviously, the borrowing requirements are a lot different than they were during the years leading into the great financial crisis. So, you have informed consumers, despite the increases in rates, that feel some sense of security, and they're getting educated on what's required to actually buy a home. So I think what you said is mirrors a lot of what I'm hearing from agents, in that the overall state of the economy, whatever people may think about it, individual buyers, they're going into these purchases despite the increase in interest rates with, strong savings and a plan, and they've looked at 500 houses. So they generally have a sense of where they think the value is. And there's, a bit of confidence on that side.
Yeah. And so, like you said, even it's still on the balance, a seller's market. But even in this market, it seems like they still want the same three things that sellers have always wanted. And the research calls this out. 87% of sellers say the certainty of an offer not falling through. So certainty. 74% of sellers want to sell as fast as possible. They want speed. And 58% of sellers say that receiving a cash offer is important to them. So certainty, speed, and cash sounds like what sellers have always wanted and always will want.
It does. I mean, also a bit of a plug for Opendoor. It's kind of the basis of what we try to do. But I mean, exactly. that's no coincidence, obviously, in that we're looking to deliver exactly what consumers consumers want. I do think, along those lines, one of the trends that we mentioned in this article is that we have seen fall through rates increase. I think 18% currently of home sales are falling through, and that's up. It's the second highest percentage since 2014, I believe. So it's becoming an increasingly real, problem in the industry. My wife's in the residential lending space, and someone qualifying, at a 5.5% or 6% rate, and then when that rate goes to 7%, can be the difference between someone losing qualification. Different things can happen during deals, and we are seeing some of the hesitancy show up in the way people are acting during transactions. So at the end of the day, despite it feeling like it's a good seller's market for many sellers, that uncertainty in the world that we're seeing show up in the data here around concerns around interest rates and the economy and all that, it is showing up in people backing out of transactions, and it is obviously in sellers' minds. So being able to deliver, the certainty and the speed and cash that Opendoor can, just to have it as an option on the table. I spend 99% of my time with my team talking to agents about having this option. Sellers are going to consider a lot of different things, but knowing that in this kind of uncertain market, having that cash offer, which is what we try to be for agents. You have this cash buyer at the end of the day who will execute. And the same is obviously, I know you've had some of my colleagues on to talk about the home building side, how important that can be. Even in this market where inventory is low, having a contingency, to buy one of those homes, obviously, can be nearly impossible. So, it continues to be true. Continues to be something that we really try to push, and I think this will become increasingly important as we continue to move towards this uncertain period of time. I don't know what's going to happen in the future. Obviously, I think a lot of people have been wrong about where the real estate market is headed over the last few years. But you have to imagine, as this business tends to be cyclical, there will be some more movement, to reach some kind of equilibrium. And during that time, I imagine these demands from sellers will only become more important.
And that equilibrium is found by buyers and sellers making concessions and finding the market one transaction at a time, ultimately. And the data here says that both prospective sellers, 76%, and buyers, 80%, indicate a willingness to make concessions to expedite the process. So again, it's this idea of buyer or seller's market, we're going to have to make some concessions in order to make things move forward. So this is, again, where your both your background and your current position really lets you talk in depth on this particular topic. So before we get to kind of the current data points, how have concessions evolved over the years, would you say?
Yeah, and that's the real meat of this survey. Concessions don't always show up in the numbers, right? The popular headline is always purchase price. People think about their real estate deal. The thing that stands out is what'd you pay for it? But concessions are one of those things that kind of exist in the background, where they're not always quantified on the settlement statement. They don't always show up that the seller was willing to leave an old Volvo in the driveway to get a deal done, as actually happened to a neighbor of mine. So they're kind of that unspoken in some ways part of the deal, and a reason why we really wanted to survey our audience on this was because you don't always see it show up. And I think that concessions, when you start to see people do different things on concessions and get more active on the seller side, that is the tipping point that shows you moving from one market to another. So as we discussed, we are by no means, moving towards this robust buyer's market, but as we move a bit from extreme seller to like moderate seller market, we're starting to see at least a willingness on the seller side and buyer side, of course, to align on concessions. So, we mentioned, what they are. These are the components that basically get deals done. It is where, in my opinion, from working with real estate agents for years, it is an area where I see the best experienced agents really outshine their competition in terms of creativity and really just general awareness on telling their customers, what can actually happen here. Because again, if you come into a transaction, you're thinking, well, I got to pay this amount and it's going to cost me this much money per month. And these are my taxes. But if you're in the industry and an expert in the industry, like many of the real estate agents I work with, you are advising your client on all the different moving parts, whether it's a closing date or getting help with, rate buy downs, and the different components, different ways that you can make concessions as a seller or as a buyer to really bring a deal together. And I think that's what we're starting to see in the survey shows. And you mentioned the 76% and 80% of buyers and sellers willing to incorporate some concessions, shows a general alignment. And I think the thing that I hear the most, and this is more qualitative than quantitative, but it backs up that point, is that 72% of sellers are buyers right now as well. So you can have the best time ever selling, put your house in the market and get 10 offers. But if you're going to buy the next home, you're going to deal with the same set of problems that every buyer is facing right now, including the 7%
Such a great point.
Mortgage rate. So I'm not going to sit here and say that sellers are deeply sympathetic or ever going to feel bad about getting 50% more than they paid for their home 5 years ago or 10 years ago. When you're selling, you're probably going to get the best deal you can. But I will say that there's a general awareness around, wow, this young family is now dealing with a rate that was triple what they could before. I'm going to have to deal with that as well. When I want to move, I'm going to have to deal with all of the things that they're dealing with. So it's kind of recognition of how tough it is. And that showed up at the top in our kind of alignment piece where this is one thing that buyers and sellers agree on, that even the sellers are saying, yeah, it's overpriced. Yeah. Like I see it. It is a very overpriced market.
I think the top one here on your list on flexibility of closing date makes complete sense. And my hunch would be that this has been at that top really ever since the COVID epidemic began, because everyone, when it was completely a seller's market, for sure, this most likely would have gone away of like, just figure it out, I don't care. But now that we're back in this more balanced market, everyone understands that just making dates align is really, really tough. I also just anecdotally, my own experience and people I know, it seems like when you close and when you take possession are also often two different dates in today's world. A lot more flexibility of, hey, you can remain in the home for a period of time after the closing occurs, or rent back, or a lot more flexibility on timing.
Yeah, the only difficult part about doing a chat with you, Kevin, is that you take a lot of my headlines. That's exactly the point I was going to make. That, and I think which I appreciate. You're an expert, so it's nice to realize that yes, that's exactly right. It's exactly where I was going to go. But again, for agents that we talk to and for consumers, there isn't general awareness of that point. It's usually like, well, I'm closing this date, the deal's funding, I better move in that date. But there's a ton of flexibility, and this is what we're seeing. With many of the agents that I talk to, it is just detaching those two things. The deal may close this date, but I may be getting 3 weeks of a lease back, so I can stay in my home, or I may be moving in early, or there's all these different things. I even heard a really extreme example from a very fortunate real estate agent who is doing quite well and has a second home down at the beach. And she was actually able to, she was representing buyers, but the seller wanted to stay in their property until their closing date. The buyer wanted to get in to do work. So the seller had nowhere to go for another 3 weeks, but that agent was actually able to use her summer home to give it to the seller for free, to basically allow her buyers to start the work. So they closed up front. Seller had a place to stay, which wasn't their realtor's house, but extreme example, a fortunate position to be in. But I'm hearing people basically make deals like that, and I agree with you. Ever since COVID, this kind of concession has become popular, and I think it's a good thing for just customers to be aware of. I think overall on the concessions piece, another thing that I hear from agents a lot recently is, you mentioned home builders and different things they're doing in that 9% figure. The thing that I hear from agents, with new construction being an increasingly large part of available inventory is that on the resale, on the used market, they're competing now with those concessions. So whereas, in the sellers markets of the past, you didn't have to go to market with a bunch of concessions. You didn't have to list on the MLS, get a $5,000 closing cost credit. I don't think we're at that point yet, but I'm hearing from agents that they're being a lot more proactive in advising their sellers to possibly play a role in a rate buy down. Now, obviously, that looks a lot different from a new build, where you can advertise that on the banner at the front door at the new sales office. But we're hearing that a lot more, that agents are trying to educate the sellers to be a little bit more proactive. And even if it means that they're going to net that same strong purchase price, just as a way to get buyers more comfortable with, getting that rate down a quarter or an eighth of a point, anything they can do to kind of just create more goodwill in the transaction. Because again, going back to this overall theme, that there's just a general sense of, it's tough to transact right now. And if you're doing so, it's like you said before, you're doing so because you need to.
Yeah. Well, I think a couple things there. One is your point is really insightful, that even a lot of shoppers and sellers don't understand how common this concession is in terms of flexibility. And so when you're dealing with an uncertain consumer on either side of the transaction, it's important somehow to communicate this and that's obviously where the experts have to come in. And how do you communicate that without a kind of starting out with desperation at the beginning? But you can imagine hundreds of consumers saying, "No, wait, honey, we got to make sure that the date lines up, because think about all the stress and the domino of other things that have to be lined up." And really, no, that doesn't have to be, but unless you help them understand that possibility exists, that uncertainty is really high. So like how you kind of remove the veil on that is important for both buyers and sellers to understanding, and if they have representation that's communicated. But the other thing that I think is really interesting is, as a seller, when you add the 18% cancellation rate of transactions, and then you start talking about this lot of flexibility that you're offering to the buyer on timing, that does seem to be a little bit like you are adding risk to the equation. I don't know if I'm saying this well, Nick, and I'm trying to find a way to make it not sound like a blatant advertisement for Opendoor. But my point would just be like, knowing that 18% of transactions are falling through, and then delaying a closing date for a buyer that might not close, it does seem like that's a riskier bet, and something that certainly should be factored into. Should I take this offer from Opendoor that has certainty, speed, and cash, versus saying, "Hey, I'll take this offer from someone else, but I'll delay the closing for 3 months," and then 2 months in they say, "Sorry, we're not doing it."
I mean, I can't disagree with you, and I understand why it could feel like a bit of a advertisement, but that is one of the primary value props. And I think specifically, and also for a big chunk of your audience, obviously on the home builder side, that unique offering that we have for our home builder partners of 9 months of close of escrow, and basically unlimited.
Say that again, because I'm amazed by the number of people I interact with who are like, they have not heard this, or it never registered to them.
Yeah, just recognizing the partnerships and the use case that we have on the home builder side. And this is not my world. This is a nod to my colleagues on the home builder side that I work very closely with. Obviously, many home builders are working with agents, so it's all related. And I want agents to know this too, that when a consumer is selling to Opendoor and buying from one of our home builder partners, or any new construction, from a home builder, they are eligible for up to 9 months for their close of escrow, with basically unlimited flexibility on when they're going to pick that date and how often they need to move it, which obviously for your audience doesn't need me to explain. It is tremendously valuable in that
Yeah.
whether it's a close date getting pushed out for a construction delay or whatever it may be, having that flexibility for the reasons that you just articulated around deals falling through. You're under contract with a traditional buyer of your own home, and their financing changes. You're out of luck on the other side there. So that is a massive value prop. We recognize how necessary it is when you're in that situation. And versions of that exist. Obviously, the flexibility around the closing date for all consumers. So when we work with agents, I think it's one of the most difficult things for us to explain to our agent partners when they talk about a closing date. We show them a calendar in product, and we say, pick the date. And they're dealing with a 60-day window, but they can pick Tuesday. They could change it the next day to Wednesday. And having the ability to have this cash buyer of Opendoor who can execute the closing on the day that the seller needs to is tremendously valuable. And also, recognition that we're going to close. We don't have to, go borrow our money the way a traditional buyer would. It's going to close when we say it's going to close. And yeah, I think if I had the ability to convey what you just conveyed around the risk of fall through and how much that can cost, if we could do that succinctly up front, I think everyone in the world may look at the opportunity even more favorably. But that's my mission, to spread that word. And I recognize there's a lot of different ways to buy and sell in the world, but that is obviously a massive benefit of working with Opendoor.
All right, my last question is: do you feel like this openness towards concessions is the new normal that we're in for a while, or what are you hearing and seeing kind of on the front lines right now when it comes to buyer and seller concessions?
Yeah, my colleagues are starting to make fun of me for saying this because I reference it so often, but I got to give my father, my original mentor in real estate, a shout. Just one of the earliest lines I've heard him say since probably the 90s, when I started paying attention to what he was doing. And I was a young kid then, but he'd always say, and this is going back to the 90s, my crystal ball's in the shop. Now I'm a dad and I'm saying the same cheesy stuff, but it is the truth. My crystal ball has been in the shop for as long as his had. It's very difficult to say, where the world is headed. I'm not an economist. Everyone I talk to in the industry now says these times are unprecedented. They haven't seen them before. And, real estate folks, they love to say, oh, I've seen this before, but this one feels especially new. But I can say, being in this industry, I mentioned this earlier, the thing to me that separates the great agents, the ones that are always doing a ton of transactions, and the same is true for sales associates in the new construction offices I go to, is that they are open to negotiating. Concessions are always a part of their business in good markets, down markets, giving people, however the market is shifting, if it's buyer or seller, but giving both counterparties a sense of mini victories is just a really smart strategy in how you're conducting your business. So, if the market continues to shift, if we get into a world where, inventory starts to come back and we get a little more balance, I see obviously where concessions appear in a transaction, either upfront on the seller's MLS listing or on closing day. That kind of shifts around the timeline of when they're used to either keep a deal together or attract new business. Sellers are certainly calling the shots today. So that means concessions are happening, but happening further on down the process. And, I just stay with that theme of not sure what's going to happen in the market, but the smart folks are continuing to deploy them in every situation, and just making sure their customers are aware of all of these different moving parts that go beyond just the purchase price.
I'm going to say something that sounds like it might be an extreme statement, but I don't know. I don't think it is. I think to me, the fact that both sides are open to concessions, I don't know if this has ever been plotted on a chart, but it makes me feel like the market is more balanced than most people would think. It's another way of just saying what we've kind of said a couple of different ways on today's show, Nick. But a savagely unhealthy market, and one extreme would be, again, where one side is like, nope, I don't need to make concessions because it's a buyer's market or it's a seller's market. And so the volume of transactions, especially in the agent world, feels highly unhealthy. But when I look at outside of the number of transactions as a data point, I think, okay, if both sides are willing to make concessions, then it's maybe a more healthy market than a lot of people would say from the outside.
I think it's a reasonable conclusion, and I think that's why, and I encourage all your listeners to check out this survey and the resulting blog and the research we've done around it. Just going back to that point of, we see a lot of headlines. We know the popular headline around price growth and it being generally a seller's market, but these concessions and the reason why we were so interested in it and the data here is exactly that point, that maybe it isn't exactly as it looks in the headlines. Maybe there's stuff going on, below the headline, behind the scenes, that shows that buyers and sellers are getting together and compromising a little bit more than the headline would lead you to believe. So
yeah,
I like the conclusion. So
awesome. Well, Nick, thanks for coming on, and thanks to the whole Open Door team for doing research like this and sharing it openly. Always good to have more insights, especially from people who have both the number of transactions and consumers that they're interacting with, but also just the general industry connections to hear what's going on the ground floor.
awesome. Thanks for having us, Kevin.
Absolutely.